Hello, so today we're going to talk about Ororon, Genshin Impact's new 4-star Electro Bow user. He's going to be a top-tier choice for Electro Charge team compositions with a unique toolkit that's going to boost team synergy and deliver consistent AoE Electro damage. So Ororon's strengths are going to shine in Taser teams, where he's going to surpass options like Fischl in these AoE scenarios. His Hypersense passive and ability with Scroll of the Hero of the Cinder City set is going to allow him to kind of be this go-to for boosting Electro Application and elemental damage. What's great is that he kind of performs well even at C0, so you don't need Constellations unless you want to amplify his personal damage and team damage. However, his utility outside of Electro Charge teams can be limited, but Night Soul aligned reactions themselves theoretically expand his flexibility, but this can be for only specific Notland characters like Chasko with Hydro, can also, fully utilize this mechanic. Still, for Electro Charge teams, Ororon is a game changer. I've personally been using him with Ayato recently, and it's been absolutely wonderful. So, some of his strengths and weaknesses include that he's pretty simple to build, thankful to his attack scaling passive, but, it typically offers around 100% uptime on his Hypersense damage, and it's going to boost his elemental damage with Scroll the Hero of the Cinder City, and his rocket jump ability is also pretty freaking awesome. But on the downside, his damage does depend heavily on triggering these Electro Charge reactions for some of his passives to trigger. Outside of those, setups, his damage can feel underwhelming, but I have found him to be very nice in Hyper Bloom teams, so that is another really, really solid option for Ororon. So for artifacts, typically his ideal set is going to be 4-piece Scroll of the Hero of the Cinder City, and this set is going to enhance his team's elemental damage output and ensure a high uptime on that Hypersense ability for AoE effectiveness. Alternatively, you can use a 2-piece combination of, say, Thundering Fury and Gilded Dreams for increased electro damage, or, you could swap in, Wanderer's Troop or something like that. For main stats, you're typically going to want to focus on an attack or EM sands. It's up to you to kind of balance out what you need in your kit. I like to run him with an electro damage bonus goblet because I like boosting his own personal damage and the damage that he deals through his first passive, Night Soul Synesthesia. And I actually run him on an attack percent circlet because I don't need crit rate or a ton of crit damage on my Ororon. If I was to run crit damage, it probably would buff his stats and damage, personal damage a little bit more. But I do like the fact that with where is it? With Night Soul Synesthesia, it buffs AoE Electro Night Soul line damage by 160% of his attack to at most near 4 by opponents. So just kind of tacking on that extra attack on there kind of helps out on his passive. So for me, I think it's okay. So I have that attack sands and the attack circlet on there. So typically, that's going to be kind of going to be where you want to hang out. Prioritizing some elemental recharge is nice just to have it, but with Electro Charge and maybe another Electro character in the party, he typically doesn't really need much, I will say. When it comes to weapons, Ororon's going to have several strong options. His best in slot is typically going to be Elegy at the End or Polar Star, both offering energy recharge, EM, attack percent, different types of buffs for different types of team comps. If you don't have Elegy, Aqua Simulacra can be great for damage application because of its crit damage, base stat, but its substats isn't necessarily too useful unless you're kind of counting the second portion of his passive. As far as, 5-star bows, really anyone is going to be great because of this, just the pure stat stick that they are. But, I would typically focus on Elegy at the End or Polar Star if you are going to run him on one. Amos Bow can improve his normal and charge attacks if you're going to run that, kind of on-field Ororon charge attacking guy, but I wouldn't recommend it. For free-to-play players, I would really recommend the Windbloom Ode if you have it, because it boosts, attack by 32% at R5, and it has EM mastery scaling. Another good 4-star option is the Stringless, because it boosts its elemental skill and burst damage, and you get to have a nice EM substat on there if you don't have enough attack. And, other good craftable options are going to wind up being, let's see, where are they? I don't know where they are. The Song of Stillness, because of its attack percent scaling. This is because you're going to be dealing an extra 16% up to 32% more damage based on if they're healed or not. So, if you're running them in a healing team, that's pretty good as well. And Hamayumi isn't that great. If you have it built and you just want attack percent, then that's fine. But, you know, you're not really going to be utilizing its passive at all. Another really good bow that you can use is Raven Bow. This is because of its Elemental Mastery main stat, and it's going to be increasing damage against opponents that are affected by Hydro or Pyro. So if you're using him in these kind of super electrocharge teams, that's going to be a great spot for this bow to kind of fit in there. You know, he's mostly going to benefit from builds that increases Electro Application frequency and capitalize on his Hypersense passive, so you kind of want to choose artifacts and weapons that fit into that role and kind of pair well with each other, kind of balance out his overall kit. Now, you do want to be careful before I dive into talents with this burst, because even though this AoE damage rotates and it can essentially hit targets multiple times, there is an internal cooldown or an ICD on it, to where during the duration of his burst at C0, I think you can only apply Electrocharge like 3 to 4 times, even though it's going to strike opponents between 6 and 9 times, just kind of depending. And if you have further constellations on him, the speed increase that you get, I believe, from, let's see, is it C2? I have to remember here. Or maybe it's C4. Yeah, the speed increase that you get from C4 isn't going to do anything in terms of increasing or decreasing the ICD. It just means you're going to get more hits of electro damage. It's not going to affect the ICD. And in terms of duration, it's not too, you know, crazy. It's okay, you know, but back to talents here. So we're gonna look at his elemental skill and elemental burst mostly. You can charge attack scale with him. It can be cool, but I would recommend you don't do that. So one of his most important parts is his Night Sling, or his elemental skill. He's going to use this to throw this spirit orb at enemies. It's kind of just like a small targeted homing projectile that deals Night Soul aligned electro damage. This orb is going to bounce up to 3 times between enemies at C0, and then with further constellations, I believe it can bounce up to 5 times, with each target hit only being once per use. So it's not going to hit a target multiple times, and if you only have one opponent, you know, on the field, that Night Sling's orb is only going to hit that target once. It's not going to hit him 3 times. So this ability is going to really allow Ororon to apply Electro efficiently in these AoE scenarios, which will also charge his Night Soul points. And we'll get back to this in a second, because his passive also utilizes this Night Sling. So, you know, in game, this is going to make him a pretty good off-field Electro Applicator in Taser teams when you swap out of this, because typically it'll have this nice uptime while you are away after those 3 bounces. So with this Elemental Burst, it's this giant rotating AoE kind of blast, I guess you could say. So it's going to allow him to taunt enemies towards the center of it, and it fires off these waves, which are also going to deal AoE Night Soul aligned electro damage. It's going to allow for a nice amount of sustain, and it's going to help just kind of apply electro charged, you know, when you have that Hydro character in that team. So, you know, it really just kind of focuses on that AoE and taunt mostly. With his passive talent, this is the most crucial for him. His Nightshade Synthesizia. It's going to enable Ororon to kind of gain these Night Soul points through team-based electrocharged or Night Soul aligned reactions. So after casting his elemental skill, he's going to acquire up to 50 points from allies' Hydro or Electro attacks, and this caps out at 80 points stored. These points are going to fuel his Hypersense effect, which is right here, and this effect is going to essentially deal damage based on 160% of his attack, and this can happen every 1.8 seconds as long as this is being procced for that 15-second duration, and it's got a pretty much permanent uptime, I would say. You know, this it kind of ties to his team coordination in that sense, because you're going to want to be relying on that electrocharged reactions to trigger this. It's not really going to be easy to trigger this, you know, without it, unless you kind of focus on maybe an electro or an overloaded kind of sense, where he is the one triggering overloaded because it's his electro attacks and you have a pyro app. And then his passive too is pretty important as well, because when his elemental skill hits an enemy, he's going to gain this aspect sigil effect, which is going to last for about 15 seconds. This is going to restore energy for Ororon. I think it's 3 energy for Ororon, and then it's also going to generate it for his team teammates when they hit enemies with normal charge or plunging attacks, and this can trigger up to 3 times per duration, so this is going to help just kind of generate a 9 extra energy, kind of reducing the amount that you need for Ororon once you do get this Ascension talent. It's pretty good. I don't really think it's the biggest thing in the world, but I still think it's pretty important. So before we hop into team comps, I just want to go over Constellations really quick. So with his C1, it's just going to allow an extra additional 2 bounces on his Spirit Orb, and then it's going to apply the Night Tide effect, and this just means that opponents affected by it are going to take 50% increased damage from his first passive talent, that passive Electro Charge kind of Electro Blast that's going to be happening. So it's pretty cool. His C2 is going to boost his electro damage bonus whenever his elemental skill or burst essentially it's going to trigger when his elemental burst hits either portion of his elemental burst, and it's going to scale with electro damage bonus every time an opponent's hit. So obviously if you have this, his C4 where it rotates faster, you're going to be getting more hits on his burst faster, so it allows for this 32% electro damage bonus cap to kind of be achieved in a faster way, so you can put out some more damage. Like typically his C3 and C5 are going to be that level up on his skill and burst. His C4 is just going to allow him to restore an extra 8 additional energy after he uses his burst, in addition to that 25% speed boost. And then his C6 is really the biggest game changer. With his passive talent, that Nightshade synthesizer that we were talking about earlier, it's going to increase the active character's attack by 10% for 9 seconds, which allows it to be stacked up to 3 times, so you can get a 30% attack boost for your active character whenever Nightshade synthesizer is active, and you can pretty much indefinitely stack this attack percent boost as long as you just keep proccing Nightshade, because it's going to just stack that 10% on 10% on 10% all the way up to 30%. It's also going to allow his elemental burst to trigger in an instance of this hypersense damage, which is going to deal 200% of its original damage, so it becomes a little bit more nuclear once you do unlock that passive talent. So as far as team comps go, it can get a little bit funky, but it can also get pretty fun. So when you kind of dig into things here a little bit, I like to, typically focus him on Electro Charge teams. A good option that I've been messing around with earlier was this Ororon Ayato team. I was using Albedo to buff EM with his Ascension 2, Kazuha to buff EM as well. I do have him C2, and then I was having Ororon just act as the Electro Applicator here, which will boost Ayato's damage. And honestly, this has been the best my Ayato's ever been. His damage is very, very strong, and I'll show a couple clips of that here as well while I talk about the next team. I've been using him with Chaska, and it has been amazing, and I run her in this team here. I do have a C2 Chaska, so that's why I do have Xilonen slotted in, but alternatively, a good option for this would be Chevreuse, because she is going to buff Electro and Pyro damage, and Chaska will be dealing those Electro and Pyro damage shells. For this team, I also do run Chaska on an Electro damage goblet, because she is hitting quite a significant amount of Electro bullets with her Shining Shadowhunt shells, and with having Ororon in here, it's just Electro on Electro, and the amount of Electro Charge damage that's going out onto the field is just phenomenal. So I would say he's a more refined Fischl in a sense, like if you can think about it that way. You don't have to deal with the clunkiness of Fischl's burst and having to deal with summoning Fischl's Oz and that long cooldown and being really energy recharge dependent. So, he's a pretty good option or swap in for Fischl. Even at C0, I would say C0 Ororon is better than Fischl. Maybe not at C6 Fischl, but I'd say if you had to pick between Ororon and Fischl, I would choose Ororon. Alternatively, you could also run him in Hyperbloom teams, maybe slotting in Furina, maybe you could run Nuvi with him, if you're doing Electro Charged, albeit I don't think it would be the best for Nuvi, because, even if you have him C6, Nuvi doesn't really worry about attack percent scaling. Baiju is also a good option to kind of slot in there. So other things that I was thinking about is if you were going to run him overloaded for that attack percent buff, Chevy is pretty much going to be a consistent slot in there because of that electro damage buffs as well. If you were going to use Raiden in this scenario, and kind of have her as the on-field, it's great. And you could throw in Kujo Sara or another Pyro Applicator just to kind of boost that. But, you're kind of missing out on that electro charge damage. If you really want to, you know, maximize Ororon's damage potential without using a strictly electro charge team, I would highly recommend a national team or a rainbow team, and that would consist of characters like Raiden or any other, you know, electro character. Focus on a DPS that aligns with Ororon, either Electro or Hydro, and then slot in either another Electro character and a Pyro character. Just have one Hydro, one Pyro, one Electro, and then you can kind of slot in your fourth for whatever DPS you would like. Typically, a national team doesn't work too well, though, with a cryo DPS. Just keep that in mind, but he is very strong. I have been using Ororon in a Mika team here as well. I'm working on building Mika DPS currently, and by having Ororon in the team here, he has great Electro Application uptime. So just as a slot in for that attack bonus, he's actually powering up Mika quite a bit. And I mean, obviously, you could swap out Yunjin here because I'm just using her to buff normal attack. So say you were running this in a Eula team, you had Mika as your support, and you were focusing on Superconduct. Ororon's going to be a great slot in at C6 with that attack buff. You know, I think it's very good. So yeah, I think that got that wrapped up. So I'm going to show some Ororon gameplay here, and yeah, that's been our deep dive. So thank you guys very much for watching. I'll comment over some Abyss gameplay here, and I'm pretty confident in saying he is a must-have for these Taser teams as a sub-DPS for that AoE electro damage. You know, let me know if you're going to be building him, what constellation you have him at, and if you have any questions down in the comments. So, you know, I'd really appreciate any type of input you guys have, and feel free to correct me if I said anything wrong. So yeah, thank you very much, guys. And then Ororon's just going to be that electro charge enabler. I mean, you're seeing 20Ks out of his burst beams here, you know, before we even get into Chaska. And I kind of screw up this rotation and didn't realize this guy kind of flies up in the air. So it would have gone a lot quicker if he hadn't done that. But you see the sheer amount of raw damage that Ororon is pumping into Chaska here. And it's just overall quite amazing. I mean, you're just seeing these little burst hits coming out of Ororon here, and then the additional electro charge damage on top of it. You know, you're really going to want to focus on keeping that burst uptime in his teams. You know, if you find yourself struggling with not enough electro applications so that he's triggering electro charge, like when he may be on cooldown, you know, just to keep that electro charge, you know, up, maybe run another electro character, maybe run Fischl in the team, maybe run a Sethos, maybe run, you know, Raiden or something like that. You know, if you're struggling with that. And, you know, this team is able to bring down a lot of things very quickly. And, you know, when it comes to the Hydro Tulpa, it'll be a little bit more difficult later because Furina is not the best to have in that team. But, you know, even though that Ororon's burst isn't hitting, it doesn't matter. You know, it should matter for that electro % damage bonus, but as long as his burst is down, he's still going to get that attack bonus as well when he uses it in combination with his skill. So getting into the last chamber here, this one I was trying to rush through because I kind of went AFK on the first half for a minute and didn't realize it. So, you know, getting into things, it's going to be that same rotation, just slapping down that elemental burst, getting up into Chaska, throwing down his E, making sure that we just try and get as many hits in as possible, you know, making sure to fully utilize all of those triggers that his burst is giving us, you know, between 3 and 4-ish with that internal cooldown, because when that electro charge reaction happens, it's just going to spread out onto the field, and it's really wonderful for AoE situations. You know, obviously against a single target like the Hydro Tulpa, it's not as prevalent how strong electro charge is, but when you are using it in an AoE scenario, it will help shred you know, a whole horde of enemies without you even needing to have an Anemo character to bring them together. It really will just chain from enemy to enemy to enemy. So yeah, I think it's pretty cool. You know, I mean, damage here is pretty consistent. I mean, even against, you know, the Hydro Tulpa, we're seeing the same electro numbers, even if it's, you know, not triggering electro charged on our own. You know, it's just occurring because it's a Hydro enemy. And I think I kind of screw up here and let my Chaska die like an idiot, but it's fine because I just swap back into Ororon and he'll clean everything up here. You know, Xilonen will still act as that red shred, but, you know, when Ororon comes into play, he'll throw down his skill, he'll throw down his burst, and that will literally clean everything up. So yeah, I mean, you just see the 20k there, seeing another 25k, 13k, just quite a bit of consistent damage coming out there. So thank you guys so very much for watching. If you have any questions, let me know, and have a good one.